I wonder, do you ever think things are impossible? I've got 3 things I'm going to mention to you. Try to work out which of those are possible and which are impossible. So firstly, could I cut a hole in a piece of paper about the size of a £2 coin and poke my head through it? Secondly, could I turn a handkerchief from one colour into another colour just by passing it through a silver tube? And lastly, if I was in another country and I was walking along, do you think a gorilla could swim across a river and attack me? So which of those things do you think are possible? Which of those things do you think are impossible? Have a think for a moment. So have you worked out which of those things were possible and which were impossible? Well, here's the first one. There's a piece of paper. There's a £2 coin. The hole in the paper is about the size of that £2 coin. Here's my finger. There's my head. Can I poke my head through the hole? Well, here goes. I'm poking my head through the hole with my finger. That one was a bit of a cheat. So the second one was, could I put some handkerchiefs through a silver tube and make them change colour? Well, here's a silver tube. You can see it's nice and empty. And here's some handkerchiefs. There's actually 2 joined together, a red one and a green one. So I'm going to put them through the tube and see what happens. So there they go, threading through the tube, green and red. Green one's gone in, the red one's going in, and then what is going to come out? Well, it's yellow and it's blue. They've changed colour. So it wasn't impossible. Isn't that amazing? And lastly, I asked you, do you think a gorilla could swim across a river to attack me if I was in another country? Well, no, that one turns out to be impossible because gorillas can't swim. I wonder, have you ever thought things are impossible and then they've turned out to be okay? Have you ever thought that a maths problem might be impossible, or it's impossible to get into a sports team, or maybe impossible to get onto the next level of a game? Well, sometimes we need help, and sometimes we find things that we thought were impossible are actually possible. So let's hear a story about somebody who realised that doing things with God meant that things were possible when everybody else said they were impossible. Today's story is about 2 groups of people, the Philistines and the Israelites. The Israelites are the good guys, so during the story, whenever I mention their name, give a thumbs up and maybe a little cheer. The Philistines, though, were the baddies, so give a thumbs down and maybe a little boo. But don't make too much noise, because otherwise you'll miss the next bit of the story. Okay, let's get on. The Philistines and the Israelites never got on. The Israelites worshipped God and tried to do what he told them. But the Philistines worshipped gods that were made out of wood and stone. They also did lots of nasty things that God didn't like. The Philistines were generally not very nice. The Israelite army and the Philistine army were camped at opposite sides of a big valley. The Israelites were on one hill and the Philistines were on another. Now there was one Philistine who was meaner and nastier and uglier than all the others. The Israelites were really scared of him. He was called Goliath, and he was also very, very tall, about 3 meters. Each day he'd come out of the camp, wave to the other Philistines and snarl at the Israelites. He'd growl and say, "You Israelites are all wimps. I'm a Philistine, a real man. Pick one of your soldiers to fight me. If he wins, we'll be your slaves. But if I win, you Israelites will be the slaves of the Philistines." All the Israelites were too scared to accept the challenge. They thought it was impossible that any of them could beat Goliath. They hid in their tents and prayed that God would help them. This went on for about a month. Then, one day, a young boy called David was visiting his brothers in the Israelite camp to take them some food. Now David heard Goliath shouting at the Israelites and growling at them. He was a bit puzzled. He frowned and scratched his head. He plucked up courage and went to the king. Your Majesty, why isn't anyone fighting Goliath? David asked. Well, he's a bit big and he's a bit nasty, the king replied. But you've got God on your side, David said. God is bigger and better than any Philistine. If God wants you to win, then he'll have anyone to defeat Goliath. You know, even I could do it. Nothing is impossible for God. The king was a bit taken aback. David explained that he'd have to fight animals with his sling whilst he was looking after his dad's sheep. God had always protected him then. So the king agreed to let David go and fight Goliath. David went to a little stream and picked up 5 round stones. He collected his sling and went out to the Philistine camp. A sling is a bit of material that you put a stone in, you swing it round your head, and then you let go of one end, and the stone flies out and hopefully hits your enemy. When the Philistines saw David, they laughed at him and called him names. Then Goliath came and growled and called David a wimp. Dave stood where he was and said, "You might have lots of armour and swords and javelins and spears and shields and all sorts of neat stuff like that. But I've got God on my side, so you'd better watch out." He put a stone in his sling and whirled it around and around, and the stone left the sling, flew through the air, did a loop-the-loop, and hit Goliath on the forehead. Goliath swayed and shook and collapsed to the ground. David quickly ran up to him, grabbed his sword, and finished Goliath off. The Israelites cheered, and the Philistines were terrified. If a little boy like David could defeat Goliath with God's help, nothing would be impossible. What would the whole army do? The Philistines screamed and ran in terror, whilst the Israelites, well, they threw a party. David knew that God would help him to do something that most people thought was impossible. He wasn't put off by the other people. He knew that God could be trusted. When we have something hard to do, we shouldn't be put off by people who tell us that it's impossible or that we couldn't possibly do it. We should stick to it and do our best. David needed help from God. God will help us, but we might need help from other people too. David was only young, and he showed people a lot older than him what was possible with God's help. So I challenge you, over the next few weeks, show people older than you how great you can be. Have a go at something you find hard, and show that it's not impossible after all. Let other people see what they might think is impossible is possible. And remember that David trusted God and could do the impossible with him.